Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I am Olta. I work as a orientation and admission at Talent Garden, more precisely at Talent Garden Innovation School. So I wanted to welcome also Pascal, who will be your guest speaker for today. But before, just a really short introduction about what Talent Garden is. So we are a co-working space for digital and tech professionals, and also an educational institute. And we offer courses such as coding, marketing, design, and other stuff. So I would go right away to introducing Pascal, and we will go right away with our topic for today. So I want to know you with more details. So Pascal is here. Hello, welcome.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here. I hope you're having a lot of fun today.
So Pascal, would you mind telling a little bit about yourself, what you are up to and how you started all this design thing, and then start with your presentation whenever you feel ready?
Definitely. So my name is Pascal Heino. I think you've seen me in the description for the event. I'm an independent strategic designer. So that basically means I'm working freelance on a contract basis with all kinds of companies, huge corporations like Volkswagen and Daimler, but also new up-and-coming startups. And so I work on product strategy for them, on product design, have a lot of basically everything that makes up a great digital product in the end. I also am currently a teacher in the UX bootcamp at Talent Garden. And I think you're going to learn a lot more about me coming up in the talk, because it's basically a very personal and talk to me. It's something that I care really deeply about. It may, like, design is your superpower may sound a bit vague, a bit fluff at the beginning. But I think once we get into it, you really get to see why I think it's important, and why I think like these ideas that I really thought a lot about in my career so far. I've been working in design for 12 years now, and have come to a level of understanding of what design is that I didn't really know at all when I started out. I kind of got into it somehow, was a little bit of a rocky path for me, as is probably for some of you, and it can feel difficult at the beginning. I hope that makes it a little bit easier for some of you. Okay, and with that,
sorry, Pascal, I just wanted to say that if people have anything to ask you, they can drop a question in the comment section, and we will answer after the presentation. So whenever you're ready, just let me know.
Yes, that's perfect. I'm trying to keep it relatively short. There may be a couple of concepts in there where I just brush over, because it's not really important to go deep at this point during the presentation. So if anything like that is interesting to you, just make a note or write a comment, ask a question, and I'm happy to spend more time talking and discussing with you, rather than extending the talk by a lot. Okay, so with that, I'd be up for just starting. Let me know when I'm visible to everyone.
Yes, you can go now.
Okay, so welcome again to Why Learning Design Gets You More Than a Job. I already introduced myself, but I would like to, again, start with a brief quote, actually quoting myself. That is, above all else, design is communication. It's about getting ideas and information across from one to another. And that is, in essence, the theme of today and of my view of design, and why I think design is one of the best skills that you can learn, why it gets you, in the end, more than just a job. But let's take it step by step. Since we're talking about design, and you're here to hear me talk about design, let's look at what even is design. And I think there's two ways to look at it. One is more the view from the outside, which is the majority of people, obviously. Most people in the world do not work in design. So there's a lot of ideas of people who obviously don't think a lot about design because they don't have to, and they shouldn't. But still, it just gets across repeatedly kind of the same ideas that may make it a little bit hard to for yourself to really understand if design is something that you're interested in, if that's something that you might be able to do as a job or learn as a skill. I think one thing that comes across or comes to mind to most anyone instantly is design is pretty. It's just about making things look beautiful and putting a little bit of visual polish on things. Another thing that I come to mind, at least for me, like oftentimes, is that design is super weird. And so I hope like a couple of these things just resonate with you. You're saying, okay, I've heard that a lot. I'm maybe thinking that myself. This thing you're seeing here is actually a couch. And something like, when I just look at the picture, it just screams designer furniture to me. Even though for me as a designer, that feels weird to say. I don't really know what to make of that. Design also is art in a way. This is a pretty famous sculpture in Berlin, where I'm located at right now, where I'm speaking to you. And kind of art and design are often really heavily intertwined and meant inexchangeably. Also, design is not only weird, often feels impractical. This is an example of a lemon squeezer that may seem out of this world. You don't really know what to do with it. It's not really clear how to use it, at least for me. And so it kind of feels impractical, but it does scream designer lemon squeezer to me still. And design is often associated with fashion. Fashion design obviously is a topic and a word that's pretty prominent. And it feels like design's supposed to be really mostly on trend, being hip, being at like the forefront of culture when it comes to visual representation. And with all of these things, it kind of feels like design is basically intertwined or inextricably linked to talent. It's just something you're born with, you're either really good at, you're just either a creative person, or you may feel like that you're not, and that makes it relatively difficult to figure out. And so oftentimes it feels like design is maybe not for me. Maybe you've been thinking that at a certain point in time. I have definitely felt that. I was always really interested in design, but always felt like I wasn't really creative enough to do that as my full-time job, to really get into that and pursue that as a career. And so in the beginning started out going to a lot more into engineering, and then only by chance eventually ended up in design, and then learning that design is actually pretty right for me. But that is, I think, a good representation of the general outsider view. Then you might be interested in design and learning more about it, Googling a lot, talking to designers, and you're getting a bit of a different picture that tells a whole different story altogether than the outsider view, but not really a more conclusive or in all of the ways more helpful. So here are things that I often hear talking to designers working in the field of UX or digital design. And so design is obviously a process. That's like the double diamond discovery phases and prototyping phases that eventually get you to a good digital product. I think that's often really synonymous with digital design, which isn't a bad thing. That's not what I'm saying. It's just a thing that I'm hearing. And then design is a craft. It's blood, sweat, and tears, and it's just a lot of work to get things right. Design is design thinking. It's kind of associated with playing with Post-its and these kinds of things. It's just brainstorming, a lot of brainstorming and putting ideas on the wall. And eventually getting into wireframes and flows and icons and all of these things that make up our deliverables, the things we produce at the end that are something tangible for every stakeholder, every other person to really see and understand and understand what our output in the end was. And then there's discussions. Designers love to talk to designers about design and to other people about design, and then they love to talk about how their field is special and how calling it something else is relatively dumb, and it becomes a thing about just names and really sharp definitions of what you should do and what you shouldn't do and what someone else's job is. And that becomes just more confusing, just for the outsider, obviously, but also for myself working inside design. It's like I have to keep up with what is the exact thing we're calling ourselves now and what is the exact thing I'm supposed to do and what shouldn't I do. It's just weird. And then finally, a thing that I'm hearing a lot is that just design is perceived as being digital design. We're started calling ourselves product designers, which is a good description since we're talking in the senses of product management and digital products. Product design is pretty on point. But then again, we kind of keep forgetting that there's a whole nother world and something that an everyday person, when they hear product design, they think of something completely different. They think of shoes, of furniture, of these kinds of things, of cars, but not really about anything of what we do. And that's just like a certain level of arrogance that I hear in there. And what that leads me to in the end, and I think could be something that you feel when you're researching or getting into the field, talking to the designers, that design does promote accessibility. It's in a way promoting the idea of designing for people and creating user-centered solutions, and in the end always thinking about a person, but at the same time really feels inaccessible for what does it even take to get into design. Am I skilled enough? Am I creative enough? Is the background I'm bringing valuable, helpful, or is it more distracting and confusing? And that kind of often gets lost. So what's missing in this whole thing, at least from my perspective, what I learned about myself, what I felt was missing, what I would like to know? Design is really human. And I think on one side of things, that's really obvious. It's something that often aims at people, at end customers. We're talking about doing interviews and figuring out what people like. But what we kind of forget often is that it's a really basic thing that we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. Pretty much everything ever since people got together in groups and came together, we've been designing things, and it's really fundamentally linked to a human basic skill, and that kind of makes it your superpower. And what I mean by superpower essentially means that, sure, learning design will probably get you a good career. It's relatively easy to find design jobs. Design is really in demand right now. So I don't really expect, if you're doing a decent job and putting some effort in, I don't really expect you to have any issues finding a good job in design and making a career out of it. And you can get really far with that. But it's a lot more. It's going to be helpful to you in all kinds of situations, just above and beyond your basic core design job. It's going to be really helpful in talking to people or just managing the organization that you're in and managing relationships with people in the organization. But it's also going to be helpful for your just private life and managing relationships in your private life. And that is because design is communication. And I mean that in the way that design is equal to communication. For me, it's exactly the same thing. Okay, 50% of all problems are an issue of miscommunication. That's a completely made-up statistic. I hope you would have asked for more clarification. That's probably been pretty obvious. But what I try to do with that is hopefully that resonates with you and it makes you think, and it makes me think, damn, all of the things that are going, so many of the things that are going wrong in life, in work, are just an issue of miscommunication, of just not understanding each other or not getting information across in the way it was intended to be. And if we could just fix that, if you can somehow get better at communication, it's going to be a skill that's going to solve a ton of problems for you. But what is communication even? That's a basic, like a so basic term that it becomes really abstract and really difficult to even define and understand, right? It's something that we do every day, but then we kind of forget what it even means. So it's simply a process of exchanging information between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, and behavior. And that has been really important all along. I teased that before. Let's just look at a couple of examples of how that came to be and why it's really core to our human existence. For one, written communication, as you can see here, has been the oldest form of communication. It has been a way to preserve knowledge beyond a generation, or beyond in a way where you could pass it between individuals to outlast a group and communicate in knowledge and helpful information beyond your lifetime. Then following that, certain forms of verbal communication, especially gossip about third parties, helped really grow the group above a certain threshold and helped us become bigger groups of individuals, become eventually clans, tribes, cities, and communicate and collaborate in a way that put humans in a much better position than basically every other animal that didn't really have this form of communication for collaboration purposes. And then lastly, a form of like communicating through symbols, as you can see with these coins, for example, was a way to communicate across bounds of groups of people, across regions, across oceans maybe even, and form a sense of shared understanding and trust between different groups of people, and allowed a much more diverse group of people to collaborate and build something that was bigger than themselves. And so I hope already that is a super quick introduction on why communication is important, right? And I hope that makes sense. But how does communication actually work now that we know what communication is? It's relatively simple. So let's look at a typical standard view of communication from Shannon and Weaver. That's basically the model you always use to describe communication, and you've probably seen that. So we have a sender on the left and a receiver on the right. They want to communicate. It's relatively simple. Our sender has a message she wants to get across, and she thinks will resonate with the receiver because she knows the receiver. She kind of knows what would be a relevant message that might resonate with him, that might make him change his behavior in a positive way, in the way that she intends. She's using a medium to send that message. That medium could just be air, by speaking with my voice like I do now. It could be radio waves, it could be anything that can transmit a message. And so she uses her domain knowledge in that medium, possibly speaking, to encode her message in that medium. During transmission in that medium, noise can distort the message to a certain degree, maybe completely, maybe barely noticeable. And so the receiver receives the message and needs a certain domain knowledge and understanding to decode the message, make sense of it, and understand it. And if all of these things work, the receiver in the end gets the message, and the successful communication leads to a change in behavior. There's a couple of things that can go wrong with communication. So there's the technical problem is issues of transmission. Often we don't really have that problem in many cases anymore, since internet should be reliable, or just we don't really have much noise in many situations. But obviously internet's dropping out, or radio waves get cut off by trees, or it's just raining and it's super loud. And so there's like a bunch of things that can really distort your transmission here. Then there's the semantic problem is, does the receiver even understand what you meant by it? Maybe they just cannot really make sense of it. And the effectiveness problem is basically describes, does your message resonate with the receiver? Does it is it something that interests them and that leads them to change their behavior? Obviously, there's a couple of barriers. Also, just brushing over it, you can dive into it more if you're interested. But there's a couple of parallels that already make that really interesting for us. And so there's physiological barriers. So am I physically able to communicate, to encode or decode? So basically, me being blind, I would be not able to read that slide right here. So that's a pretty obvious physiological barrier to communication. Cultural barriers, often different cultures have different meaning in things. Sometimes shaking your head from side to side means yes. In other cultures, like in Germany, it means no. That can be a really difficult cultural barrier. And then most importantly, I would say it's individual domain knowledge. And that means basically, do you know how to work with that medium? Am I able to properly encode my message in a way that you can understand it? And can you properly decode the message and make sense of it? So to end that with a quote, to effectively communicate, we must realize that we're all different in the way we perceive the world and use this understanding as a guide to our communication with others. Hopefully already that really rings true to you and makes a lot of sense, thinking about that lens of user-centered design, of human-centered computing or design. And obviously, there's a lot of parallels, and that is the way it should be. In order to communicate, we really must know the person and understand them deeply, who we want to communicate with. So how do we now communicate through design now that we have a basic abstract understanding of communication? Pretty simply, I would say. Let's look at fashion design here in the sense of product design of a shoe. The designer on the left side has a message they want to encode, something they want to get across with their shoe. So they're using their skills in designing shoes to communicate that message, and the receiver gets that message. It resonates with them. They want to buy and wear the shoes, and the whole thing is ideally successful communication. A different example, more in our domain, the sender can be a designer and or developer. Together, they have an understanding of that medium. That can be an app, and know how to encode messages in that medium. And the receiver is skilled enough in their knowledge of using a phone and in using apps on that phone to understand your messages in the way you encoded them, decode them, get your message, and change their behavior accordingly. So there's a couple of things that design communicates, and just having heard of them is pretty important and makes this whole thing make a lot more sense, I'd say. So let's look at them. One is affordances, and that basically means, what can I do with a certain thing? Does it communicate to me how I can use it and what I can do with it? The second thing is values. What does it communicate in sense of status or just personal values and ideals that I want to portray to others, or that I want to portray to myself? That things that can be luxury, obviously, is a common value, and exclusivity, but it can also be like the complete opposite. Maybe you don't want to you really don't want to portray that image of luxury and want to really distance yourself from that, then that can be a value what you want to communicate. And the final one, I think, is pretty obvious. It can just be direct content. So that would be like written communication or clear instructions, or just plain obvious information in the sense of language that you want to get across. So to make these things that also can seem a little bit abstract more clear, let's just look at a couple of examples. This is a stackable chair. I think that's pretty obvious. And to me, it does communicate a bunch of things. It doesn't really communicate content. It does communicate values in a way that I think it looks relatively cheap. Maybe that's something I'm into. I wouldn't really go for it if I want to portray some high-end furniture and high-end feel for a space. But most of all, it communicates affordances to me. So I can see that it looks relatively light. I can lift it, but these carves at the corner indicate to me that I can stack multiple on top of them relatively easily and store them. And I think that's the core thing this thing communicates to me. Then another object that may not be immediately clear, but this is a shoe. And I would say that although most shoes communicate affordances pretty quickly, this one doesn't have that at the top of their priorities. They obviously really care more about values. Like, it should be extravagant, it should be luxurious. It can even be obviously uncomfortable because you're just portraying more status than anything else with this shoe. A magazine is a design instrument. This one obviously focuses a lot on content. I think that's pretty clear. From looking at a magazine, the affordances should be pretty obvious in a way of how you use it, and the look and feel that went into the graphic design and the layout really communicates some values about being future-focused, tech-driven, interested in these kinds of things, and you want to portray that image as well when you're holding that and want to portray that to others. Some completely different things. This is a customer journey that I've worked on in an agency a while ago. And obviously, content is really important in a customer journey. This is also a thing we've designed that has use for people. But also affordances are relatively important. So we have at the top row these arrows that indicate the reading direction, and want to lay it out in a way that it guides you through and you understand where to go, what relates to what, and how you can use it to make sense and use it in your work. And a more on-point example from end products. This is from Google Trips, a screen of the app, and that basically combines a lot of the things we've just talked about. It combines values of being light and fun through the imagery, and want to make it feel really easy and enjoyable. Then obviously there's content in it with the direct instructions, and there's a couple of affordances. For the button has an affordance and tries to communicate to me that I can click it, and the 3 dots at the bottom try to communicate through an affordance that I can swipe it, and there's 3 different stages. But already here, it should be pretty clear to you that the level of understanding all of these things just really depends on my skill in a domain. So for me as a designer, it's obviously clear that the 3 dots at the bottom mean 3 different pages. If I ask someone who doesn't really interact with these kinds of things a lot, or just doesn't care about onboardings and always ignores them, they may not know that. So how do you make all of that work for you? I mean, it's great to know that, it's great to have heard that, but can you actually give me some steps to directly apply that? And I have an example, also just brushing over here, but I think that should make it a little bit more clearer. So let's look at some redesigning of a search experience. Oftentimes on Dribbble or similar websites like that, you see things like that. I got that from Behance, I think. And it's an unsolicited redesign of a really common, popular product, in this case, Facebook search, and it looks pretty clean. The presentation's great, and like it's relatively polished. They put a lot of visual effort into that, I would say. But with all of that, and that's like not the only one, there's hundreds of these things on all of these different platforms, then taking these really nice visual inspirations and looking at the most popular search engine on the planet, and we can ask ourselves, so why does Google look like that? I mean, it's obviously not the lack of designers. I think they probably have more designers than most other companies, definitely among the top of the world. So there has to be something why this product still looks like that and is the most popular digital product probably on Earth. To understand that a little bit better, I came up with the communication canvas that's relatively simple, but can help you in the early stages of understanding these different priorities. So we'd fill out our canvas by stating the primary communication goal, to communicate information that's most relevant to the user and make it easily accessible. So that's what we want to do. I hope all of you would agree with me that for most searches, that's the key job they have to do. And so with that, we can break our statement down and go through the affordances, values, and content and prioritize these and say, okay, most importantly is the content communicate the information. So presenting relevant results is the most important thing for us to do. And then affordances is the second most important thing. People need to be able to instantly recognize how to use that, how to get to their destination. And then on the third spot for our case is values. Obviously, we want to have it reflect the brand image and so on, but it is a distant third from the other one. And so looking at it from this lens, it's pretty clear that there's a lot of information on that. It's a lot of focus on differentiating the different types of results and giving a lot of context information for all of these results. So the content part obviously is number one. And then moving on to the affordances, the blue link is still the most obvious internet way of presenting a link that is universally accessible to most people and really obvious to most people. So that's why Google still looks like that. And then moving on from that, I think a little thought into the brand image, but brand image here also is relatively minimal. Often, as we've seen in the contrast of these examples, there's a couple of problems when we look at that. So one thing, the sender, that's us, the designers in that case, could just be not very skilled in the domain. Maybe they don't really know all of the things that are critically important on how to communicate in a medium, how to present the affordances and all of these things, how do we use style buttons and everything in a way that it makes sense to the most people or our users using it. But I'd say with skilled designers or people really interested in digital, that isn't really the case. We can expect they really know how to work with the medium. But then there's two other big problems, and that's either that people are just not as skilled in decoding the message in the medium of understanding what we've put into as we thought, or that we just design for priorities and a message that doesn't really resonate. So going back to our example from before, we really put a lot of priorities on the values of the expression, and secondly, probably the affordances, and sure on content, but not really giving a lot of thought in the structure and presenting content in a super easily scannable way. And so that might just not resonate with what our users and our customers in that case really want to do and really expect from your message in order to behave accordingly. So I did talk about decoding the message. So one thing you should always consider designing in a digital medium is computer skills. There's been a huge study across 33 rich countries by Nielsen Norman, the links in the bottom right. And they analyzed how well people can use computers. And we don't really need to dig into all of these levels you see here. The most important thing is that I can already promise you that all of you listening are in level 3 in the top 5% of using computers, and that there's a whooping 26% that barely have any computer skills, basically none. So always be just aware that whatever you think is obvious in a design may probably not be obvious to most other people. So having that in mind, there's a bunch of things that can go wrong communicating in digital design. You, as the sender, might not really know what's the correct message you should encode that would resonate with the receiver. Then maybe you're not really skilled in the domain or don't really understand how to use it. Our receiver could be sick and distracted and have issues that come in as noise for decoding, and maybe not really have sufficient skills in using the platform or the medium that they're in to really decode all the messages, even if you encoded them well, and then just in the end not get the message and be just super disappointed because they're using a design that just doesn't work for them. So we're almost at the end. Rounding this up, how can you effectively frame communication? I hope many of these things seem obvious to you, and also these are something you've heard before. Then I think we've done something correct. So try to really understand your audience whenever you're designing or communicating, which is the same thing. Understand what they want to hear, what is a message that makes sense to them, that resonates with them, and that is something you should communicate, and that works for both you and your goals and them and their goals. You want to define your message, so frame and phrase your message in the way that it makes sense and is something that they can decode, and encode it in your medium. Use your skills, learn about the medium that you're working in to really understand how to properly encode your message in that medium. Try to measure reception, figure out after you've sent if people understood what you want, if that message you sent resonated with them, and if you achieved the effect that you wanted with your design. And finally, iterate your message and encoding to improve every time you're doing that, and just get better, make a better product and get better at your job every day. And if you keep all of these things in mind, you can basically design everything. And I mean, you can design digital products, you can design all kinds of other products and media, online or offline, but you can design relationships and you can design communication in your private life and help alleviate and reduce misunderstandings as much as possible, and also get the ideas that you have in your head and that you come up with across in a way that they're strong and make sense to the other party, and just achieve a lot more in life, in work, and personally. And having said all of that, knowing that design is the same thing as communication, I want to just leave you with one of my favorite quotes, and that is, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Thank you. Here's a bunch of places where you can find me, but you have the link in the event instructions to my website. I think that's the best place to get in touch with me, find me on the socials or my website. And thanks so much for listening.
Thank you a lot, Pascal, for your presentation. So I don't know if people have questions. If you do, as I said before, just drop them in the comments. But I have a couple of questions, actually. Okay, we have one. I will let the participants go first. So we will have a chance to see it here. Andrea, hello, I have no experience in design, but I want to start learning. Which is the first step? This is interesting because I had the exact same questions, because students that I interview often ask me this, so I really wanted to also have your opinion when I answer them, but I guess Andrea was fastest, so we'd like to know.
Okay, perfect. I think you've already made the biggest or most complicated step by saying that you want to start learning design. I hope that many of the things I said today made sense to you, and that even just learning about communication and just Googling more and understanding that concept of communication makes you a good designer, I would say. And then this should be your baseline, and on top of that, you would just need to figure out what is the thing you want to design. To get really good at design in a certain area, you need to learn the domain. The core skills is that process, that approach, that's going to be the same. And I think you can learn that relatively easily. Even just maybe the talk is enough to really understand that. But then you need to take it to the next level and say, I want to learn digital product design, or I want to learn fashion design, or I want to do furniture, or whatever you want to do. Start Googling, look up resources, and decide for yourself at a certain point if you want to visit a school. You can visit something like the Talent Garden Bootcamp or an online school like that. That can be a great start. You can do a university degree, or you can just try doing it on your own and get an internship at a company that does design relatively well and just learn from experience. I think you just need to figure out what's right for you.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question. Here we go. Irene, looking at UX specifically, how do you keep the process creative and engaging for you? Does it ever get boring?
That's a great question. The best answer I can give you is just not really keep the process that you learn and the frameworks that we're teaching and that others are teaching really as religion, and just try not to always do them the exact way every time you approach a product. Ask yourself, what is the most interesting thing from a human perspective you can learn about that? What is the thing that you actually don't know? Because we do have a lot of things going in from our experience that we take for granted, and then often teams approach research in a way that they just learn the things they already knew, and that at some point gets boring. So ask yourself, what's the thing you're most curious about? What's the thing that would be most surprising to you? Try to figure these things out, and try to keep your approach fresh every time. Change up the frameworks and the exercises in the way that they make sense to you. Cut out everything that you think is unnecessary for your project. Freestyle the presentations. Just improve and change your process and your documentation and your way of working every time. Then you're just getting better every time, and it keeps getting interesting.
Okay, so I have a question now.
Okay.
I don't know if you have ever experienced difficult customers when they want something and they are stubborn, and you professionally thinking it's that it's not the way to go. How do you deal with those customers if it ever happens to you?
Oh, it always happens. Obviously, some are easier to work with, some are more difficult, some are more stubborn. And I'm also reading a question that kind of comes into that. Is it a choice to work independently? Someone asked. For me, it's really easy to answer that question, because if a client is too annoying and the project isn't interesting enough, and just choose not to work with them. But if it's something that you're an employee, or you really want to work on that project anyways, you just have to convince them, or try to convince them with facts in a way, or with learnings, and try to have them understand that just their opinion may not necessarily be right. Often people are really sure of their personal opinion. And then you try to do quick and dirty, cheap research, try to talk to people and try to uncover voices and opinions from actual potential users and customers that indicate a different direction, and present to them what you found and why they, and try to communicate to them, which is, again, comes back to the skill of communication. The more you do that, the better you get at this level of design, of talking to your stakeholders and trying to convince them that they're sure in a position where they've maybe learned about their field for 20 years because they've been at the company for that long, but that doesn't mean that they know what the customer actually wants or needs in their life, because they have a completely different view on things. Especially, like, I've been working with many large banks as clients, and in their field, they're often really sure about knowing what people want when they even don't. I hope that was helpful. It's difficult every time. Just try to be creative and come up with relevant new information, and communicate that well.
I get it. So I don't know how it started for you to work as a freelancer. Like, did you get a project and you would just went like along with it? You liked it, or was like your first plan?
I've worked at basically all kinds of different companies. So I've worked at product companies where we were just in-house designers when I started out, then worked at a relatively typical UX agency, moved on to a venture building company that built new startups. But through all of that experience, I kind of learned for myself that these constraints of a company often makes things really slow. And even if you're working in an agency, there's so many things that people not working on the projects decide for you that often isn't really the right thing for the project on the one hand, and on the other hand, you don't really have that much of a choice of what kind of projects you want to work on, what's exciting for you, and yeah, what you want to take on and what you just want to say no to. And so these things together for me meant I wanted to do that for a long time, wanted to go freelance, eventually made the jump. And then it worked out relatively quickly. As I mentioned before, you're not going to be having difficulties finding design jobs nowadays. There's a huge demand for design. Yeah, I just let everyone know that I'm now independent, and pretty much got interesting offers from then on.
Okay. What about the portfolio? I hear it all the time with designers, and we also do some activities in our bootcamps and part courses regarding the portfolio. I just want to know your opinion on how important is that for a designer.
It's important and not important. It's absolutely crucial, but it's a pain to do. I would say most designers, most independents struggle with keeping it up to date. Same for me. I have periods where I have more free time, work on my portfolio more. Most of my projects are a year or two, probably like 2 years old already. I don't really think I've really updated my portfolio in the past 2 years. And so with that, you absolutely need to have one. I think there's no doubt about that, because you're just not going to get considered if you don't have one. It should be relatively recent. But for me now, I'm just getting too many interesting requests to have time to update my portfolio. So it's not really a big liability that it's not super up to date. The less requests you're getting, the more you should keep your portfolio up to date, I'd say. And then for my top tip on what to do regarding a portfolio or how to set one up, I would always say do it online, digital, in a website format. PDF portfolios are sometimes requested, but it's really, I think, not really timely anymore, not really up to date, not really the way to do it, and not really consumable. And then you basically got the choice of setting up a really creative portfolio page on your own, which is something you should do when you're going more into art direction, when you're going into more visual design, and more of the execution side. I started to focus a lot more on product strategy and discovery. And so I've basically focused more on the content of the actual case studies, and I set my portfolio up as a Medium publication, which just gives me basically no layout options. You have a couple of things you can do with images, but gives me a good place to write down and to put my images in there to just communicate a good story about what I've did.
Okay, so one final question from my side. I always do this whenever I have a speaker, because I sometimes hear like really interesting answers. Like, what do you think that your job would be if not a designer?
Oh, that's a great question. I'd probably be an engineer or something like that, which is what I would have become before I got into design. So I was looking into architecture and tech programming and like really hands-on engineering. My father was an engineer, and so that's kind of the thing I grew up with. What is a great career, what to do. Didn't really know, maybe that came across in the talk, that design could be for me. I always was painting and was interested in art, but never felt creative enough to really start studying design or really get into design. So yeah, I think if I hadn't discovered design, I would still be doing that. I would just not be as happy and successful at it.
I was just about to ask you, like, do you regret ever? But you're happy, so you don't.
Oh,
So,
definitely not. I mean, that might not be the same for everyone, but having learned all of the things regarding process, regarding being flexible with your work approach, changing your formula every time, and focusing on this core of communication, I find it super easy now. It's something that comes naturally, that you are just curious at a certain point of the outcomes, and by that curiosity I come up with the next thing I should do in a project, and so it kind of is fresh and interesting every time.
do you think that it helps you like keep an open mind, like from that moment that you saw that you started doing something that you never thought you would, now you're like more open-minded to other possibilities in the future?
Oh, definitely. I think that's a great question, and brings me back to the point where I was in the talk about titles and specific framing of what your job should be, which is something that many people do that I don't understand at all. For me, is I do whatever in this whole project, from coming up with an idea of a service or a digital product until it's finished and released, and even then continuing. I do whatever it takes at the very moment to do that, and I would do something different if I wouldn't be doing that as well. I think the core ideas of just figuring out what people need and trying to come up with processes to give it to them is applicable in almost every industry. It's applicable in science, which is something I would be really interested in any other field I can think of, really.
So, Pascal, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation and also your answers. So I hope we can do this again in the future. I see there are no new questions in the comment section. So I would say thank you to everyone that participated, and also Pascal. I will probably see you in the future.
Likewise, it was
really nice.
blast.
Have a nice evening, you all, and enjoy this really nice weather. At least here in Vienna, it's really nice weather. Though I haven't seen outside like in a couple of hours, but I hope it's not changed.
Yeah, same for me. Bye.
Bye. See you.